Hi, I'm Dr. Tony Evans, and I'm excited for you to join me on Heroes in the Bible. Please be sure to follow the podcast on Apple or Spotify so you get the newest episodes right as they come out. Welcome to the epic adventure of David, a story of honor, battle, jealousy, darkness, friendship, love, scandal, and murder. While most people know of David the myth, few know about David the man. This episode begins with bloodshed and a gruesome scene that will test the strength of your stomach. Everybody in the kingdom is reminded that David is not a typical king caught up in pettiness and feuds. He is a man of honor, and a few characters will learn that the hard way. The episode ends with David's greatest victory since Goliath. As the landscape of David's life changes and the dynamic of the throne becomes more complicated, it is nice to be reminded that he is still the David we know and love. We are reminded of David's integrity, steadfastness, and wit. If you have followed David's story until this point, that means you are invested in his life. You've been rooting for him and hoping he steps into his calling. Hopefully, this episode gives you a brief moment of pure satisfaction. These next few episodes are a gift and a well-deserved break from heartache. We get to see David as the noble king he was promised to be. We will follow him through victories, triumphs, concerts of praise, and a new life. Enjoy these moments, soak them in, and glorify God for his goodness. But be cautious and tread lightly. Remember, David is not the true hero. Jesus is. Even the giant slayer can succumb to darkness, but that is a topic for another time. First, a prelude to a simpler time in David's life, a time by the fire with his good friend Jonathan. Let's step into the light with episode 21, United and Prepared.
Prelude to Chapter 21. David and Jonathan leaned back by the fire, resting their weary legs. It was a warm night, and the stars were laid out on the horizon like a blanket. Jonathan sat opposite David by the fire. Although he was older than David, and the first in line to receive the throne of his father Saul, Jonathan knew in his heart that David was meant to be king. He could feel the presence of God upon him. Jonathan, being a humble man, elevated David above himself. He looked down at the royal robe he wore, given by his father. It never did feel like it fit him. The role of king was never something he truly thought about, although his men talked about it often. Jonathan looked over at David, who was poking at the fire. He watched as David took a stick and ensured all the coals were touching one another. He tended to the fire with the same care he tended to the sheep. Jonathan stood up and brought a wooden chest out from his tent. He placed it on the floor next to David.
"Open it,"
Jonathan said. Confused, David opened the chest and saw Jonathan's royal armor. Light steel scales covered the leather armor. The shoulder plates were formed to perfection and polished perfectly. It reflected the firelight. Underneath the armor was Jonathan's sword wrapped in bearskin. It was lightweight but sturdy. David took it in his hand and held it next to the firelight. It was a magnificent blade, far superior to the dull blade he had been wielding. Jonathan took off his royal robe and placed it on David's shoulders.
"These are all yours now, David. Take good care of them."
David looked over to Jonathan, who sat back down across from him.
Are you going somewhere that you need me to take care of these?
He asked.
"Of course not.
Jonathan chuckled.
I will be here to fight beside you until my dying breath. A warrior's armor and sword represents his safety and entire life. I give these to you as a symbol of our friendship. I care more about you than my own life."
David was dismayed at Jonathan's love and friendship. His own brothers had always mocked him and cast him aside. He had never known the feeling of true brotherhood. David stroked the royal robe that Jonathan had put over his shoulders.
Your royal robe is not an armor, Jonathan. Why give it to me along with the rest?
Jonathan's smile quickly turned into a serious gaze. He leaned over and stared intently at David through the fire. Its flickering flames reflected in his eyes.
"I have given these to you because you will be the next king of Israel. You should be dressed and armed as the prince, not I."
You are the firstborn son of the king, Jonathan.
David replied.
I am the youngest son of a herdsman. There's no place for me on the throne of Israel.
God uplifts the humble, David.
Jonathan said, leaning his head back and looking up at the stars. David nodded and smiled. He wrapped the robe securely around his back and shoulders.
Let us make a covenant with each other. Under the eyes of God, you and I are for each other. Our friendship will prove to be stronger than any jealousy, envy, or ambition.
David stood and extended his hand above the fire. Jonathan stood to his feet and linked his arm with David's.
A covenant of brotherhood between you and I. May God give us favor.
The two of them spoke into the night about the future of Israel, God's grace and power, the Philistines, and all their minds could muster into conversation. David did not know it, but God was healing the wounds in his heart, formed by his father and brothers. God was giving the forgotten son a sense of family and belonging. Chapter 21. United and Prepared. Not a star could be seen in the sky. Clouds covered the firmament, blocking out any light from shining down on the streets of Gibeah. In the dark alleyways of the city, two shadowy figures ascended to the palace. The murky midnight sky provided a perfect covering for the two men to slip by the palace gates unnoticed. They ran through the courtyards, feet as light as cats. Through the gardens, they climbed the lattice to the king's chambers. They slipped quietly through the window and slowly approached the bedside of King Ishbosheth. The last of the embers from the king's fireplace glowed red. The shrouded figures loomed over the king like messengers of death. Slowly, each retrieved a dagger from their cloaks. As the king slept soundly in his bed, the two men brought their daggers in close on either side. Swiftly and decisively, the two of them drove their blades into the king's lungs. A single gasp came from Ishbosheth before drawing a final breath into the cool midnight air. The last remaining son of Saul had been murdered. The two men removed their hoods and lit a torch in the room. The light revealed them to be Banah and Rechab, the two sons of Rimmon from the tribe of Benjamin. They had been faithful warriors under King Saul, both captains of raiding bands.
It is done.
Banah said in a serious tone.
The son of Saul is slain. Now we can make way for King David.
It is what had to be done.
Rechab said.
We have secured our place in the ranks of David by killing his enemy. Now we must bring the news to him.
Rechab took his sword from behind his cloak and drove it through Ishbosheth's neck, cutting off his head. A crimson river flowed from his body, soaking the sheets and dripping onto the stone floor. The two men wrapped the slain king's head in burlap and escaped out the window. The two hooded men slipped by unnoticed and went by the way of the Arabah all night to Judah. Excitement fueled them as they journeyed through the night. They expected King David to be very pleased with what they had done. As the night drew to a close, the men finally arrived at Hebron. The sun began its ascent over the valley, and Rechab and Banah were waiting at the gate of David's humble palace. The brothers waited for David to exit the doors so they might bring him the news. However, they were surprised to see him already walking among the trees outside. David often rose before the sun, breathing in the crisp morning air and singing praises to his God. Rechab and Banah were giddy with excitement. They approached him and bowed.
Our great and mighty King David, may you live forever.
Banah cried out. David was surprised to see the two sons of Rimmon so far from Israel.
After the death of Abner, we knew that the only remaining hope for God's people was to have you sitting atop the throne.
David said nothing in response to their flattery. He knew the brothers of Rimmon from his days under Saul. They were brutal and self-serving men, always willing to shed blood but never willing to seek peace. David peered down at them, awaiting the news on the other side of their pleasantries. Rechab unwrapped the burlap sack containing the head of Ishbosheth and laid it at David's feet.
Here is the head of your enemy, Ishbosheth, the last remaining heir of Saul. The maddened King Saul sought after your life for years. It should please you to know that now all his sons are cut off from the earth.
David looked down at the head of Ishbosheth. The color had been drained from his face. It was a pale and terrifying reminder of the fragility of the throne. In just one moment, it could all be taken away. David sighed and gestured for Shammah and Uriah. The two mighty men approached and stood beside David. The three of them looked down at the head of King Ishbosheth. then back at the brothers. David knelt down and wrapped the head back in the burlap.
You were not with us in Ziklag, so you would not know this story.
David began in a deep and stern tone.
There was an Amalekite messenger who came to tell me of King Saul's death. He was grinning cheek to cheek, just as you are now. He told me with a reverent tone, "Behold, Saul is dead, and I killed him," as if he were bringing me good news.
David then stood to his feet and put his arms behind his back. He looked down at the men with an intense glare, burning right into their very souls.
Hear me when I say this, sons of Rimmon. I do not revel in the death of God's kings. The reward I gave that man for the news was a swift death. Tell me, what should your reward be for killing an innocent man in his own house, in his own bed?
The two brothers did not have a moment to speak. Shammah and Uriah seized them and bound them. David led them outside the gates of Hebron, near the pools where people often came. The coolness of the morning was beginning to dissipate, and the summer sun had settled firmly in the sky. Onlookers from the city watched as Banah and Rechab were drug out in front of everyone. They struggled to be freed from their binds, but Shammah and Uriah were far stronger than them. A crowd began to form as David paced back and forth in front of the brothers. His eyes portrayed a deep and righteous anger bubbling over. David shouted for all the people gathering to hear.
Know this, people of God.
His natural, gentle, and poetic voice was now booming like a warrior's.
I take no joy in Ishbosheth's death. He was the son of Israel's first king, and the brother to Israel's finest warrior, Jonathan, whom I loved dearly. Ishbosheth, as weak and fearful as he was an appointed king. Many times in the wilderness I had a chance to take King Saul's life, yet I could not, I would not. For if we make a habit of slaying kings, we lose our heart as a holy nation. We do not slay God's appointed kings. The blood of Abner and the blood of Ishbosheth are examples of what happens when our hearts fall from the merciful character of our Lord.
David then nodded to Shammah, who took his sword and cut off the hands of Banah and Rechab. The brothers screamed in agony, looking down at the bloody stumps where their hands used to be. Blood spilled onto the dirt below. David nodded again, and Shammah cut off their feet. They writhed in pain and begged for mercy. But David knelt down and said,
King Ishbosheth did not get the chance to beg for mercy. You slew him in his sleep like cowards.
David nodded, and nooses were tied around the men's necks. Shammah and Uriah pulled up, raising the men into the air with their necks bound. The two brothers hung beside the pool of Hebron, wiggling to be freed until finally losing breath. All watched as Banah and Rechab swung in place, blood dripping down and soaking the earth below. It was the most brutal sight they had seen from their king, yet in a way it comforted them. It comforted them to know that their king was a man who would not seize the throne through assassination and secrecy. He walked in the light, and was before God and his people as a bold projection of God's character. Yet even the noblest of God's heroes can fall, a lesson David would soon learn. Hebron was filled to the brim with people cheering. A sea of faces laced the city streets, making a small pathway for the new king of Israel to enter. David opened the door to his home to see a procession of elders and priests before him, ready to escort him to the center of the city. David walked slowly, almost nervously, into the fray of people. They clapped and sang as he passed them, but the sound was drowned out by David's heartbeat. He was visibly nervous. For all the battles he had fought and won, and all the danger he had survived, this was one of the more frightening moments of his life. People from Israel had pilgrimed to Judah in order to see the coronation of their new king. David, after all his running, fighting, and warring, was finally going to be made king over Israel. David wore the royal robes Jonathan gave him. He remembered his words said so long ago by the fire.
God uplifts the humble, David.
He ran his fingers through the sleeve of his robe. For the first time, the royal garments seemed heavy. With it, he felt the weight of an entire nation on his shoulders. David walked the streets, looking at the faces of his people, his new flock. Young, old, rich, and poor, all shouted hymns of praise to God for sending them a leader. David paced himself behind the elders and priests, smiling and waving at all the people calling his name. He wondered if he would lead them as well as Jonathan would have. He pondered what would have been if Jonathan had not been slain on the battlefield. The procession finished at the center of the city. The crowd circled the platform where the elders stood above David. Large pillars held up the roof above the platform. David breathed in deeply, then walked up the steps and knelt down before the priests. The elders, representing the 12 tribes of Israel, quieted the crowd and said,
"Behold, we are all your bone and flesh, united under you. In times past, when Saul was ruling over us, it was not he who delivered us from the giants. It was not Saul who led the charge against the Philistines. It was not Saul that inspired fear in our enemies. It was you who protected us, who brought us out of danger and led us to victory. Even in exile, you watched over us and destroyed our enemies. And now the Lord has said to you, you shall be shepherd of my people Israel. You shall be prince over the nation. Let it be so. We anoint you king of Israel."
A crown was placed on David's head, and the priests anointed his head with oil. David closed his eyes, feeling the warm oil drip down his forehead. He remembered Samuel anointing him so many years ago. It seemed like a lifetime ago. He was among his sheep then. Now, he had a new flock. David, on the eve of his 30th birthday, was now king of Israel. One day, another king would emerge in his 30th year, a king who would be anointed by God himself, and his coronation would be a baptism. He would be the true king of Israel, the King David would ultimately point to. David sat around a large stone table with some of his loyal companions beside him. Eleazar, Joshabim, Shammah, and Joab stood at each end of the table, counseling the king for the battle ahead. David stroked his beard and looked down at the map of Israel. Its borders were curved around one central location, Jerusalem. It had been a Canaanite stronghold for the past 400 years. Since Joshua led the occupation of Canaan, no tribe, judge, or even Saul had been able to seize it. Its walls were heavily fortified and reinforced, and the slopes leading up to the city made it difficult to storm from any side. Within the borders of Jerusalem were the Jebusites, an arrogant and brutal Canaanite tribe, renowned for their ugly form of warfare and lack of respect for human dignity. They were a glaring reminder of Israel's inability to follow through with God's commands to occupy the Promised Land. David leaned over the table and pointed at the spot on the map.
"There's no use in storming through the walls,"
he said.
"A raid on Jerusalem is nearly impossible."
Is there a chance of them meeting us at a central location?
Eleazar asked.
They know they're safe within their walls. It would not make sense for them to march against us.
Joab retorted.
They know we will be trying to take the city eventually, but they don't seem to care. In fact, they've been quite vocal in mocking us. What have they said?
Eleazar asked.
They said that even an army of blind and lame men could defeat David.
Joab answered. David chuckled and shook his head.
They only mock us because they think they are safe behind their walls. They will not be saying such things when we meet them face to face.
David turned to Joshabim.
"Joshabim, what do your spies say?"
Joshabim pointed to a spot on the map and said,
"The walls are well fortified. The arrogant would curse us and laugh if they saw us marching against it. However, there could be another way through the walls."
Joshabim circled his finger around the wall to the eastern side of the city.
When it rains, the water travels down the mountain towards the city. So the Jebusites created a water shaft that drains the water into springs in the city.
Joshua drug his finger through the wall and into the city.
Since it has been dry a few months, there should be enough space for us to climb into the shaft, wade through the tunnels, and come out the other side in the city. We can strike them right in the middle.
It's brilliant.
Shammah exclaimed. David smiled with fire in his eyes.
This is it!
He yelled.
This is how we take the city!
The rest of the men agreed and began prepping for the battle to come. David and Joab mapped out an exact plan of attack. It would require precision and excellent execution. No mistakes would be allowed. The two men planned into the night, obsessing over every detail. Since being reprimanded by David for murdering Abner, Joab had been much more submissive. He knew that he did not serve a weak king. Although David was far younger than Joab, he was stronger in character and heart. He demanded respect. Joab and the entire army of Israel would listen to his every word. 2 days later, David marched with his men through the mountains surrounding the border of Jerusalem. The Rocky Mountain ranges were treacherous and tough to navigate, but David and his men were prepared. The king wore the armor given to him by Jonathan. The steel scales reflected the harsh sun above. Sweat beat down David's head past his scarlet headband, pushing back his light curls. Jerusalem finally came into sight. It was a glorious city, filled with untapped potential for God's people. For too long, it had been occupied by uncircumcised idol worshippers, while all the while, it could have been a city of hope. David turned to Joshua.
Have the men rest. We will attack when the sun begins its descent.
Joshua had the men rest and eat. They sat in the shade of the mountain for a while, waiting for the right moment to attack. When the sun began to set in the west, David stood up and alerted his men to arm themselves. He stood up in front of them and said,
If we want any chance of striking the Jebusites, we must go through the water shaft. Once we are through, we must be careful. I hear there is an army of blind and lame men waiting on the other side.
The men chuckled and David gave a wry smile. He turned to the city and began hiking down the mountain. David took a small band towards the water shaft, while Joab took the bulk of the army around the mountain towards the front of the city. The sunset on the other side of the wall painted the sky a deep red. If David believed in omens, he would say it was a sign to the Jebusites that blood was coming. The small army finally reached the entrance of the shaft. The opening was about 5 feet tall and just wide enough for them to fit. They crouched down and squeezed their way in. Water came up to their waists, and soon it became hard to see. David was ahead of them, ensuring that every step was safe for them to proceed. He could hear the water rushing and falling down in front of him. The king took a step forward and realized that there was a drop-off ahead of him. He stopped and whispered for his men to halt. Looking with the little light he had left, David leaned forward and saw that the shaft went downwards, likely falling into a basin at the bottom. He smiled.
Jonathan would have loved this,
he thought to himself. He looked back at his men and said,
If you are brave enough, have faith and follow me.
With those words, David jumped forward and slid down the shaft into a pool below. Once the men saw that their king was unharmed, they each slid down one by one. The shaft became increasingly more dark as they proceeded. David relied on his hands and feet to guide the way. The shaft grew more narrow, requiring them to swim through until it became wide again. Finally, after an hour of climbing through the tunnels, David could see a faint light in the distance. The shaft gently sloped down into a pool within the walls. David and his men drew their swords and quickened their pace. The last rays of sunset shone through the exit. David's quickened march became a sprint when he reached the end. He dove through the exit of the tunnel, diving into the pool and popping his head out of the water. David screamed with vigor and excitement. Guards immediately saw them and sought to defend themselves, but they were too late. Like bees raging out of their hive, the army of Israel came swarming out of the shaft into the city. David drew first blood, slashing 2 of the guards to their knees and ankles. David reached the center of the city with Eleazar. The 2 of them fought side by side, warding off any advance from the enemy. Each of them toppled dozens of soldiers, slowly making their way further into the heart of the city. The rest of the men secured the borders and all the sentries posted at the wall. They opened the gates, and Joab and the rest of the men stormed the city. Every soldier was killed, and as the red sun finally set over the horizon, Jerusalem's streets ran red with the blood of David's enemies. Israel proved its strength in a decisive fashion. The kings of the Jebusites surrendered immediately and bowed their heads to King David. The stronghold of Zion had been taken. Now it was called the City of David. It would be David's new home. He and the nation of Israel would occupy it and use it to spread the grace of God to all the nations. David became great in the city of Jerusalem. Kings of other nations sent him cedar, gold, stone, and workers to build David a palace unlike any other in Israel. A royal bastion of strength, dignity, wisdom, and worship was established there. What wonders awaited the city, David did not know. All he knew was that he needed to bring God's presence into the city for the people. He needed the people to be one with their Creator again.
Was it nice to hear Jonathan's voice again? The prelude was taken from an earlier episode to remind us of David's beginning. Jonathan was one of the first people besides Samuel to recognize David as king. He even gave up his royal robes and armor, further strengthening their bond. The memory of Jonathan is everywhere in this episode. David has him continually on his mind. Why do you think that is? Why is David particularly reminiscent in this episode? Perhaps it is because he was given the mantle Jonathan gave up for him. Think about how different David's life would have been if Jonathan had not given him his robes and armor. Saul's jealousy may not have burned as hot. David may not have been an exile. Jonathan may still be alive. Our new king is keenly aware that this was originally Jonathan's throne for the taking, but he willingly laid it down for David. In so doing, the warrior prince displayed the nature of true royalty. Musician and songwriter Joel Ansett said it best. The nature of true royalty is not having a golden crown. It is learning to lay it down. This was certainly the heart of Jesus. Philippians 2 tells us that Jesus was in the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself by taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men. And being found in human form, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. Jesus laid down his life so we could be elevated. We walk with life because Jesus walked to his death. The way Jonathan laid his life down is a similar picture. He didn't consider being a king a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself of his title and took the form of a subject to David. He humbled himself so David could thrive. So the life David lives is because of Jonathan's sacrifice, much like the lives we live are due to Christ's sacrifice. So when you listen to past and future stories that mention Jonathan's armor and robes, remember that truth. David is a king because Jonathan humbled himself, and we are called children of God because Jesus laid down his life. After the prelude, we're brought into the shadows with the sons of Rimmon. They sneak into Ishbosheth's room and assassinate him. It is a gory scene, but not as gory as their punishment. They brought David his head and presented it to him as a gift, as if he would praise them for slaying a king. David is outraged and tells them the story of the scavenger who claimed to kill Saul. The sons of Rimmon are punished in an agonizing fashion. It seems intense, but David wants to make an example of them. He wants the world to know he did not take the throne by assassination, coups, or bribes. The sons of Rimmon also learned a hard lesson. David is not like other kings. While most kings want to gain power by any means necessary, he stays within the boundaries of his convictions, while other kings would gladly cross them in pursuit of glory. Saul crossed those boundaries, and we saw where it got him. Many men have and will continue to assume David is like other kings. He isn't, and that is precisely what makes him God's chosen hero. This episode also gives us the long-awaited coronation. David is now king of Israel. This moment was for you and I, who have followed the highs and lows of David's life, wondering if this moment would ever come. Our hero has been crowned. The Civil War is over, and now David can rule righteously and step into his destiny. Doesn't it seem like we've been waiting an eternity to get to this moment? That's on purpose. David's life is meant to have parallels to Jesus' life. In the story, when David is anointed with oil and given the crown, we hear, "It seems like a lifetime ago." He was among his sheep then. Now he has a new flock. David, on the eve of his 30th birthday, was now king of Israel. One day, another king would emerge in his 30th year, a king who would be anointed by God himself, and his coronation would be a baptism. He would be the true king of Israel, the king David would ultimately point to. David finally took the throne at age 30 and stepped into his calling. Jesus, at age 30, was baptized by John and stepped into his calling as well. Jesus' first proclamation was, "Repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand." Both heroes began their journeys at age 30, and both began to build their kingdoms. David's first mission as king was to take the city of Jerusalem from the Canaanites. The city of Jerusalem will eventually be known as the city of David. Jerusalem is hallowed ground for the Jews. It was the place where Abraham nearly sacrificed Isaac, and it was the place where Jacob had a vision of heaven. Jerusalem was built in the land of their forefathers, and it would be the place where David's son, Solomon, built the Holy Temple. He takes the city and claims it for the Lord, cementing his legacy. The victory at Jerusalem cannot be stressed enough. In this moment, David etched himself into the mythos of Israel. His name will now be spoken of among Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Moses. David consecrated Jerusalem for the Lord, and other nations sent him supplies to build a palace. This is an important detail to the story. Why would other nations bless David and donate to his kingdom? Well, in hindsight, we can say clearly that Jerusalem will be a great city for all nations to be blessed. Through that city, millions of people will come to know and worship God, not just Jews. It is fitting that other nations would bless Jerusalem because Jerusalem will bless them. This episode ends with a foreshadowing of great things to come. What wonders awaited the city David did not know? All he knew was that he needed to bring God's presence into the city for the people. He needed the people to be one with their Creator again. David, without being a priest, will act as an intermediary between God and people. His connection to the Lord will help guide the spiritual development of the nation. We will see that on display in our next episode, The Worshipful Warrior. Thanks again for listening. For more inspiring stories, daily prayers, and wisdom to last a lifetime, go to pray.com. And to expand your Heroes in the Bible journey, download the Heroes of the Faith devotional at tonyevans.org/heroes. Follow the podcast on Apple or Spotify to get the newest episodes right as they come out, and always be inspired by the Bible. God bless.
Hello, my name is Matthew Potter, co-founder of pray.com. I wanted to ask, do you know what your bank does with your money? At America's Christian Credit Union, your everyday banking helps grow churches, expand the reach of missions agencies, and supports fellow believers across the country. Learn more about specials for switching to ACCU and their nationwide banking capabilities at americaschristiancu.com/pray. Plus, the peace of mind knowing that this credit union is federally insured by the National Credit Union Administration.